All right, I think we can start. Welcome everybody to this session about SPA editing with Sling to the rescue. My name is Gabriel Walt, and I'm here together with Hanish and Sharanya. I'm a product manager for AM Sites and have been working on this feature together with Hanish and Sharanya, who can maybe also quickly say a word about themselves.
Thanks, Gabriel. Hi, my name is Hanish Bansal, and I'm a computer scientist at Adobe. I've been working on AM development since the last 7 years, and I am part of the core team that developed this SP editor.
Hi, I'm Sharanya, and I'm a developer in the AM Sites editor team. And I've been working predominantly with SPA for the past year, and I've been at Adobe for 2 years now.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's start with a definition again. So to me, a single page application really is defined by the fact that the page doesn't reload when the visitor navigates. And this has actually a number of implications. The first one is that the front end is consuming the content mostly as JSON from the backend. And the second is that the front end then is doing all the rendering of what has been, of all the content that has been consumed. And that rendering usually happens with some JavaScript framework. And in a lot of projects, this actually implies that the authors don't control the view because the view is now decoupled from the backend. The author are working on the backend, so therefore they cannot control that view as it's being rendered in the front end. And it's up to the developers who need to implement each view in that front end using JavaScript. And in this session, obviously, we are kind of challenging that last point and saying that this is actually not correct. It does not necessarily imply that authors don't have a way to control layout and that developers must implement each and every view. It's not that this would be a bad thing. And actually, there are a lot of benefits in form-based editing. Like the authors can then really have a much more guided process. They are therefore maybe faster in creating the content and more systematic because the form is kind of giving you a rigid system to enter the content. And the developers also are actually consuming a more strict schema from the backend because the form is kind of imposing that content schema. And therefore, they also can be maybe more efficient in consuming that content and also have more freedom because they can make a layout as they would like it to be. But it also comes with a number of downsides. And for the authors, the biggest downside, I think, is that they lose the capability to create content-specific layout. So not all content can be given a rigid layout. You have all these kind of marketing content where you maybe have an arbitrary sequence of components like title, text, image, teasers, carousels, and the authors really need to create a layout that is specific to the content that they want to highlight. And authors also don't have the capability to optimize the content to the context because they don't really have a full preview and they don't really in that preview have an ability to change the content. So therefore it's much harder to optimize the content to that context and to really the context being here really what the visitors are seeing. And on the other side, the developers really become a bottleneck when this kind of more marketing content becomes more predominant because they need to be really called for every layout that it has been to be created. So let's see now maybe in a demo how actually we can have in-context editing to be possible with something that is a really standard single page application. You could take your own single page application in this demo and imagine how that could be possible. And for that, I'm handing it over to Hanish.
Thanks, Gabriel. share my screen. I hope you can see my screen now. Okay, so we will be now demoing how to make an existing external single page application editable in AEM. Here you see we have a single page application based out of React, currently hosted outside AEM on my local host 3000, but it could be hosted on any domain for that matter. This application happens to use right now GraphQL APIs to retrieve the content that is right now driving the content structure of this articles. When I click on these tabs on the background, this application makes GraphQL queries to AEM and fetches the result. These GraphQL queries look like this. So basically, we are saying searching for surfing. If I execute this, you can see we see two items in the results like Bali Surf Camp and the like, which are shown to us over in this app here in this view. I'll just reload the app. Yeah. Okay. And so the point here is that you can have call any of your own APIs as well, and it can be any traditional existing single page application. It doesn't have to be built in a way that it knows anything about AEM. If you are interested more about the GraphQL topic, you can follow a presentation from yesterday on GraphQL capabilities in AEM. Now let's see how we can have this application editable inside AEM page editor. So we will go to AEM sites. Here we have created already a basic structure of a page which extends a remote page component, which is provided by the open source SPA remote page component, which is provided by the open source repository SPA project code. All that we need inside AEM is to be able to load our application is to know the URL of our app. So for that, I will go to the properties of this page. And as you can see, we have a SPA tab in the page properties, which contains the remote SPA configuration. Here, for the purpose of this demo, I have already configured it to be localhost 3000, which is my app domain. I'll save and close this. In return, what the AEM expects the app to provide, our single page application, to have asset manifest.json like this, so that AEM can load the application inside the editor. So I'll click on edit. And as you can see, the app gets loaded inside the page editor. Some of the components on this page have overlays and are editable. What has enabled this editing is that the front-end developer basically inserted a virtual paragraph system on top of this app. This virtual paragraph system fetches content from AEM and inserts it into this experience. We can click on title, image, or text and edit those, or we can even add a new component inside the grid from here. So let's try to edit this image. Maybe, so I'll click on the side panel, and from this side, I'll try to change the image to drop this and change it to something like this. And you can see the image gets updated inside AEM. Let's go back to our app. So right now we had the previous image. I'll reload the app, and our image updates get reflected in our app as well. And why that is happening is because of the virtual component that we mentioned that is fetching content from AEM. That's good that it works for the root page of our application. But what about the other states? Let's say we have, let's take for an example, a different state of our application, say Bali Surf Camp. Currently, it looks like this. And we also want to be able to edit this inside AEM. So similarly, I will go to AEM, and here we have, like the previous example, created a page which maps one-to-one to this particular state of our SPA. So I'll click on edit. And as you can see, this particular state gets loaded inside page editor, and the sections are editable as well. So this time, let's try to change the layout of these text components. I'll click here and maybe reduce the column count to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And similarly for this text component, let's reduce the column count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And these components, instead of being on top and bottom, they get aligned parallelly to each other inside AEM. Now let's go back to our application maybe and see if the layouting changes are reflected there as well. So I'll go to the same state, Bali Surf Camp, and whoa, you can see both the components are now being seen parallelly. So the layouting and editing, both the informations are being persisted for all states of our app from the page editor. Now, what enables this editing to happen inside a remote app is basically that it makes a call to model.json like this. I'll zoom in a bit. So the app is making call to model.json, which provides the content like this, text, and also the layouting information like this. Like for the text, we configured it to 6. So please note that these requests are different from the ones that we saw in the beginning of the demo related to GraphQL, which were only providing us with the content and not the layout. That concludes the demo, and I will give it back to Gabriel to take you further through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanish. So yeah, you saw that basically everything you saw is working on AEM as a cloud service, as well as on AEM 6.5, and all the rest of the things that we're talking here is applicable to both as well. And what you saw in Hanish's demo is that his demo is using basically two API. There was the GraphQL JSON API to fetch regular content, as he said, that has no layout, where the developer then really owns the layout and can construct everything and really define where each element goes. And basically the good thing with JSON, with GraphQL, is that the developer really knows which properties need to be fetched from the backend, because and that's the whole point of GraphQL, right? You can request certain properties because as a developer you know exactly which properties you need to create your layout. In the page model JSON, it's a little bit different. You don't have that flexibility to build a query. And the reason for that is that basically you have in that JSON, in that model JSON, everything that the author has configured. And if the author could configure something, it is really expected from the author that this is used to create the layout from. So typically, for an example, if in image component you have added on your image a link to another page, then the author really expects that the implementation of the rendering of that image component makes use of that link that has been configured. Otherwise, it would be feeling broken for the author. So this is why we have kind of these two API. And you can also imagine how in that example that Hanish walked you through, you could actually take any single page application, even actually much more complex single page applications that you might have, and insert these editable content areas where authors can insert content. It's really the aim of this feature is that you can inject or let authors inject their content in the existing single page application. So yeah, let's quickly look at what it means in context editing. What are the features of it? First, it needs to be able to load the existing experience, right? That's the first thing that it must be able to do. The second thing is that it must let authors edit the content that is coming from AEM so that authors can optimize that content into the context. And third, it must let authors use some building blocks that allow them to create content and layout. And let's quickly go through these 3 steps to recapitulate, or to recap what happened in the demo that you just saw. So first, to load the experience, we have the remote page component that you saw, which allows the author to configure through a page property which URL is to be loaded. And there you can really use also an external third-party domain URL. You need to configure maybe some cross-site scripting stuff, but otherwise it's really very straightforward. The only thing that is requested or expected from the SPA that is located at that URL is that has an asset manifest JSON, and Hanish has quickly shown that to you as well in that demo. This remote page component is provided by that GitHub project that you can use and deploy to your project so that you can make use of it. And if you start with the AEM project archetype, then this is available there out of the box, and you have 2 options basically with this archetype. You can use React or Angular to generate your project. Then the editor needs to recognize the editable content on the page. How is that happening? And that's really where I think the subject of this, or the title of this presentation is taking its root, because Sling is really making all of that possible. You need to make some elements editable, content ID, which is the Sling resource path, and the content type, which is the Sling resource type. And really Sling here is providing us the basic notions that make this possible. And we need to basically convey this information to the editor that is loading the application. And so the DOM that is rendered by the single page application needs to expose on the elements that are rendered what the resource path is and what the resource type is. And with that information, the page editor will be able to recognize the editable elements and load the UI to make them editable. So if we need that information at rendering time, we obviously also need that information when querying the content. So in the JSON, in the model JSON that Hanish has shown you, this information is actually present. So if we look at a component, like here, the page component, the path of that component is actually the path that we are requesting. And the resource type is there explicit in the JSON. And that is the case for every component. We have a convention. The components follow kind of in the JSON the path that they are at below the page. So you can here for every component see the path that they have and the resource type as well. And then the editor needs to be able to have something like building blocks. And so there needs to be kind of an agreement between AEM and the front end that is rendering the experience, what these building blocks are. And so we have the with mappable method here that allows you to map the JavaScript components that you build and that you use to render your experience to the components that you want to have inside of AEM. So here, typically, we have an example of a text component, and we see how the last line here is doing this with mappable, mapping it basically to the resource type that we had also in the JSON. And that is really important because this information is also then used by the paragraph system or the container that is used to basically iterate over the content of the JSON. And it will delegate to the individual components that are registered here, the rendering that needs to be happening. And then we obviously also have this container component provided out of the box. This is the example for React. There is another one for Angular, works basically the same. And this is doing everything that you need to basically iterate through the components. And you see at the example below how you can actually insert that component at any place in your application. So you can just take your existing working application, insert a container somewhere, and this will make the content from AEM appear within your single page application at that location. And obviously the layout container or this paragraph system does a little bit more than just actually iterating through the children. It is also providing the layout that the author has configured. So you saw how Hanish has resized the components to be one next to the other. And this is basically how in the model JSON, we communicate this information from the backend to the front end. And this container component will actually do all of that for you. You don't really need to mind about it. But if you are curious, this is how it's working. It's basically consuming these class names and inserting these class names on the individual components that it is iterating over. And with the CSS or the CSS grid that we're providing, it will make the layout automatically as expected. So this is how it's working. And actually, in all of that, what we have shown you here, there are two really important things that are new. And these two things are usually called SPA Editor 2.0. But don't see it like a breaking change in the SPA editor. Everything that worked before is still working more or less the same way. There is no big difference. But there are two fundamental new features or capabilities that we have added here. And that we basically wanted people to really understand that there is something really new that simplifies the work a lot. And that's why we have called it that way. Might not be the best word or naming, but anyway. So the first feature that we have here that the demo also showcased is the remote page component that is now also working for Angular. We have recently added this support, but originally it worked for React. Now it also works for Angular. And we have also recently added the capability for that page component to open child states. So you, as an author, you saw Hanish could navigate to a child state and open that in the editor as well, and it was opening the corresponding state immediately, so the authors can kind of have then an easier way to navigate to the state of the application that they wish. And you have the concept of virtual components. So you saw that basically container component example that I showed you, that piece of code, that is basically a virtual component that might or might not exist in AEM. If you start to create content for it, then that content will start to appear in the application. But typically in the example that Hanish has shown, not all child states do have a corresponding page. Only some do have. And those that have allow the authors to insert content. If authors want to insert content on other states, then they first have to create that page as well. And then they can start creating content for the other states as well. So what is really important here is that we have kind of changed the things around, because originally the SPA editor was really driven by the page hierarchy. And now you can actually have more the page hierarchy that is driven by the states of the application. So there is a stronger decoupling in that feature between the SPA and the page hierarchy. You don't have to have an SPA that must follow the page structure from AM. That is more decoupled. And with that, let's go to another demo to quickly look at the code and how a little bit more deeper dive in the code setup that we are providing you with, what that you need to do. And with that, I hand it over to Sharanya.
Thank you, Gabriel. So now we'll just take a quick look at the changes that are required from a technical perspective for enabling remote. So let me share my screen. Okay. So here, first and foremost, you need to include the 3 SPA SDKs. In this case, it's the generic SPA page model manager and SPA component mapping. And since this is a React app, we are also using AEM React editable components. Bear in mind that this is the same as was already being used for SPA 1.0, just that it has some additional capabilities for handling remote editing as well. So once you've included these packages inside your project, you can now go ahead and do model manager initialization. So this is a very crucial step, and it needs to be done at some point before the actual application is rendered. So this handles not just the initialization of the model manager, but also initialization of all other related internal classes, the creation of the model store, and so on. So previously, we already had an API for initialization. However, it was synchronous, which meant that the application render could happen only after all these set of operations were done. So now we've introduced this new method, which is asynchronous in nature. It also accepts an optional param. So an interesting use case for this is suppose you want to extend and create your own custom model client to perform requests to your AM instance, which is hosted elsewhere. You can do that and then just pass it in here. So once the initialization is also done, the application is already ready for you to create your own set of components, which can be used for adding in context sections. So for example, let's take a look at a simple component. So this is a title component. Here you can either use a component that is provided out of the box by React core components, or you can even create your own custom React component with its own rendering logic. You would also need to pass in the resource type as already mentioned by Gabriel previously, which is required to actually map this component to its corresponding component on AAM. Once this is done, with mappable handles all the remaining things. It fetches the model of the corresponding path from AAM, as well as adds all the data attributes necessary as mentioned. So it's just these attributes which help AEM identify that these components are actually different from the SPA specific ones, that these are editable within AEM, and also helps it to add the necessary overlays with the corresponding dialogues. So once these components have also been added, this application or SPA is now ready to have in context AEM editable sections in. And it's as simple as that. If you would like to know more, there is a tutorial mentioned at the end of the presentation, and you can also refer to all of our SPA SDKs since they're all open sourced. And that's it from my side. Thank you, and back to you, Gabriel.
Sharanya. And yeah, we're reaching the end of this presentation. Let's take into the Q&A, I would say. I have two resources here for you if you would like to dive into this. First, the first link is basically allowing you to set up the demo that we have shown you. This is in the form of a tutorial that brings you step by step through the setup of how you can build the same thing as well. And if you need more of a general overview of the SPA editor, then you have the second link that might be helpful as well. Let's quickly look at the individual questions we had here. Maybe let's start from the top. There was a question: would you recommend using SPA editor for complex SPAs that have many calls to services, etc.? Do you think it's better, or when do you think it's better to have the SPA inside of AM or exposing content in a headless way to an external SPA? So what we have shown you is really a single page application that now is making requests to the GraphQL endpoint. That was kind of the starting point, and then we added how to that application, how you can make calls as well to the model JSON, but it could make calls to any other backend or API that you might have, right? It's not so yes, I would recommend you to use the SPA editor for any kind of single page application, even more complex one, as soon as you want authors to have capability to insert content in a self-service manner. So you maybe have specific locations in this single page application where authors maybe want to insert content, and that would be using the method we have highlighted here. Maybe next one. Yeah, there are a few we answered as well in text. So let me pick the next one that hasn't been yet answered. Does this editing also work fine for nested components? And I'll let it to Sharanya or Hanish to answer. So how does it work for nested components?
Yeah, it should work the same way as for nested as well, just that virtual component support is not yet available for containers. We only have it right now for standalone components. So if you want to edit something or create a new container, that will not work. So in that case, you have to have a node pre-existing on AEM. But if you already have content existing, then that should be fine.
Thank you. Next one, does the SPA editor allow to insert experience fragments which contain various components? And the answer to that is not actually on the SPA editor itself. It's more on the experience fragment component. What is important is that the referenced experience fragment is, or the content of the referenced experience fragment is kind of inlined in the JSON. If it's not, you have to make another asynchronous call to that other experience fragment. So it's important that the experience fragment component does embed its JSON content in the JSON of where the experience fragment component has been placed. And this is the case, I think, now. I think we have added that recently, that feature, the capability to the experience fragment components. Not sure if you want to add something to that. Otherwise, let's move on. SPA editor has currently some annoying limitations like the lack of inline image editing, style system support, page diffs, etc. Are there any technical reasons, or will this be fixed in the future? So on inline image editing, this is, I think this is, I don't know if, I think we addressed that. The style system is coming. We are also having now the style system, I think, in the JSON output, or it's being worked on. And on the page diff, this is a limitation that might stay for a while. The reason is that the page diff is computed by making a diff of the HTML that is coming back from the page before and after. So if you want to see the difference of the page between view, I don't know, certain versions or live copy versions of that page or such, then we are analyzing the HTML coming back, and this won't be applicable if the HTML is rendered in the client side. So this limitation, we'll need to see how we can fix it, address it. The other ones are either already addressed or being addressed. Next one is about whether we have plans to support web components. And I would say web components are already supported. It's a different thing. If you want to use web components, then you don't need to use the SPA editor, because the difference with web components is that the information needed for the web component to initialize is in the HTML. You don't retrieve that information through JSON. And when everything you need to initialize your single page application is actually inside of the HTML, then you don't need to have the SPA editor. The SPA editor is really required to use only when you consume the whole content as JSON. So web components have always been possible to use and can continue to be used as they were before. Another one, will 1.0 and 2.0 working ways be support, or ways of working continue to be supported going forwards? I do think so. I think both are complementing use cases. So you have use cases where it's more SPA 1.0 because you really want the page hierarchy to drive your applications and the application states, right? If you create, as an author, if you create a new page, you want a new state to exist in the application. That's more SPA 1.0. And SPA 2.0 is more when it's more the developer or some other system, like in the example, it was the GraphQL API that defined the states. and you have your page hierarchy that is more than following the states that already exist in the application. So both use cases are absolutely legitimate, and it's not like 2.0 is a new way of working, stop using 1.0. No, that's why I think the wording is not so happy. Yeah, both will continue to work. One more on whether you can use Vue.js with the SPA editor, and we do have a partner that has created some implementation for Vue.js. So I don't have the link on the top of my head here, but search for it. There is an implementation of what we did that also exists for Vue.js. So basically, none of these features really are limited to Angular or jQuery or React. I mean, these are just that we implemented certain things in Angular and React to simplify your work, so that you don't need to reinvent like the responsive grid component, or so that you don't need to redo the with mappable features. But you could implement them for any other framework, and we do have a partner that did that for Vue.js. Another one, how good does the SPA editor tutorial work together with TypeScript given the flexible structures? Not sure to understand the question. I don't know if one of you understands it.
Not sure what he means by flexible structures here, but in general, yeah, like you should be able to use TypeScript in your SPAs. Even, in fact, we moved some of our SDK repositories to TypeScript as well over time. So it shouldn't be a problem.
And I think we need to, yeah, maybe one more, but otherwise we would like you to be able to go to the next session, which is really a great follow-up to this session. It is actually how we can use React and Angular as core components, how there are basically a React and Angular version of the core components available. So if you're interested in that, please go to that other session. We have 2 more minutes. Maybe we can take the 2 last questions that have been asked. Just talking a while for SPA page edits and layouting modifications, which were initially created, let's say in React app using custom CSS, when it defined the overlays for model manager and edit using the author view, does it change the CSS defined under app? I don't. Does one of you understand that question?
So
no.
yeah, my understanding is that basically, like if you already have some existing SPA and you are adding, when you are adding new components from AEM, basically you have a virtual component, and at that time you are the AEM is authors are driving the layout of the new virtual components, and at that time those will be applied to your virtual or the components coming from AEM. And yeah.
Can you maybe also quickly take a shot at the last one? Does the AEM SPA editor still need to load the model data after a route change did happen, since that caused an empty page flash?
So yeah, not necessarily. If you want, you can, as was the case previously, where you can load the entire model for the application of multiple pages in one go, so that it's not needed, or you can just, fetch just the sections that you need to reduce the amount of data that you're picking. So it's up to you how you structure your application. So if the data is not available and you're trying to display something, then of course it will try to fetch the model. But if you've already fetched it previously, then it would be available in the model store. So I think conceptually it's quite similar to how it already is on 1.2.
Okay, thank you. Wrapping it up here for you to go to the other session. Wish you a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.